Welcome back to the Breathing Problem Productions podcast. I'm Rusty Kelly.
And I'm Amelia McKay.
And this is our first episode in, I don't know, is it like 2 years or something? Let's look. I'm going to check Spotify. The last episode we did was December 21st, 2021, and I interviewed Charlie. And the episode before that was December 14th, 2021. We did like a whole set of episodes, like December 6th, December 14th, and December 21st. Like, we were hardcore.
Mm-hmm.
And then we stopped being hardcore when 2022 hit. Like,
yeah.
And now it's 2023, and we have like a giant list of like stuff we always are like, we should talk about that in the podcast that we never do, you know?
Yeah.
And like, one of like the big things that we always said, that Amelia said, that we both said we wanted to do was talk about Bresson, Robert Bresson, basically our favorite filmmaker. And
I remember wanting to do this a year ago.
Yeah, and
around this time, it was around like Christmas time last year.
I think it was supposed to be the next episode. It was like supposed to be January 20. But like, I think what happened is yours and mine respect and love for Bresson's work, like it seemed like too big a project.
Yeah.
Like to pump ourselves up over a year later to do this one, I think we really had to say like, it is what it is. Let's go through the film. Amelia actually read the novel Mouchette by Georgios Bernanos. I think I'm saying that correctly.
I think it's George.
Yeah, right.
So I'm really glad we actually waited this long to do this episode, because I feel like I maybe have like more to say about it now than a year ago.
Yeah.
Something like also significant about this book and like the theme of the movie is suicide. And quite recently, I lost one of my friends to suicide. And so it was like right after she died, I read Mouchette. And
you'd obviously seen the movie a million times.
Yeah, it's my favorite movie. It was like a really, really good way to kind of enter into this kind of it was a good way for me to process grief and understand suicide more, and still kind of reach that place inside you that where like no matter what happens, like you can still kind of find like the beauty and meaning in life and the reasons to like live, you know? And so it's all been really helpful for me in like the last month to kind of
would you say, because I read the book the last couple of days, but I'm curious, do you think it's important to have read the novel? Does the novel kind of add to your love of the film and vice versa? What's different about the novel, would you say?
The novel is like, it's written in a way that like no film, nothing could actually like touch on this kind of private, ineffable experience of suffering. Right. And so you read it too, you finished it.
I guess maybe I'm jumping ahead of myself. Let's talk about why Mouchette, the film, first is so important. So Mouchette is a film by Robert Bresson, made in 1967, a French film. He made it right after his other film, Alhazard Balthazar, which both these films are kind of like siblings. We won't talk about that film right now, maybe for a different episode, because it's a great film too.
Yeah, it'd be way too much.
But it's a pretty simple story, essentially, like many of his films are. And the actual plot is that a young girl who lives in a French town who's very poor, whose father and brother are bootleggers, and the father's a horrible alcoholic. Her mother is dying, most likely of like breast cancer or something, and it's there's no way she's going to get cured or be able to afford it.
She also has a newborn baby.
Right, the mother. And essentially the beginning of the film, unlike the novel, actually shows Mouchette and the way the French town either ignores her or makes fun of her or kind of abuses her and treats her terribly. And the main kind of action of the film begins when Mouchette, after school, is caught in a storm in the woods on her way home and gets lost. And she meets the town kind of out. He's basically a poacher named Arsène. I might be saying that wrong.
An illegal poacher.
Yeah. And he's at the town drunk also. And he meets up with her. It takes her to his shed, lies to her and says that, there's a tornado. He calls it a cyclone. And that she needs to hide with him. He's also on the run. He thinks he's killed a man. Mouchette gets raped by him. Then the next day happens. She gets home, realizes that her mother's dying. Her mother dies basically immediately. Mouchette leaves to tell the town of her mother's death. She sees various townsfolk and they either mistreat her or make fun of her.
There's 3 awful women as Bresson describes the last encounters of her life are 3 terrible, awful women who all say she's like a piece of shit at the very end.
Right. At the beginning, they're actually supposed to kind of feeling sorry for her, and her mother just died, and they're trying to kind of, but in the end, they treat her terribly, and then finally Mouchette kills herself by drowning herself. So what would you say some of the themes of the film are?
It's really hard to describe this, but it's like suffering from this, like, in this private way. It's like Mouchette, the main character, is completely alone in her world, which there's no love in at all. And so it's just this like kind of existence of being trapped in this silence. This there's no way to communicate your truth, and there's nothing to share about your experience. So it's kind of a book about prayer, but not in the sense that Mouchette prays to some god. It's like a silent cry or plea to the only one that's listening.
For understanding.
So the listener, the reader of the book and the watcher of the film, their role is God. That's what, Bresson gives us as like this, he sets us up to be the only one who can understand and love her. We can't stop what happens,
but we can empathize.
Mm-hmm.
And I think also, Bresson he kind of created, some people call it Catholic filmmaking, or his version of Catholicism.
Right.
But in the sense that a lot of his films, I think, or many people think, are about suffering as kind of closeness to God. To suffer is to experience the divine. And that suicide is, in some of his films, is like, there's a good essay that says, some of his earlier films said that like suicide was a way to kind of redeem oneself,
mm-hmm.
but that with like Diary of a Country Priest, death is like a redemptive quality maybe, but that with Mouchette, there's she's
at the end of her.
At the end, she's not alone anymore because she's one with consciousness or with God or whatever you want to call it.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, there's a loss and there's a misery of her life being cut short. But
yeah,
and so I would say like suicide, alienation, to exist and to cry out for understanding and love, and also to rebel. And there's many different themes, but I think another thing we should mention before we get started is why Robert Bresson, what made him special.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing he's known for is writing a book called Notes on the Cinematographer, or Notes on the It should be Notes on Cinematography. Maybe that's in some place, but it's
Notes on the Cinematograph.
right. Is the way it's our book is, and one of his, it's an amazing book. Also, one of my favorite authors, Dennis Cooper. That book inspired him to finally understand how to write the George Miles cycle. But one thing that Bresson is all about is what he calls like using models instead of actors. And I'm looking at an interview with him, and here's just a quote. It says, "The field of cinematography is immeasurable and full of shadows. I find my way like a blind man in a kingdom of the involuntarily, or perhaps voluntarily sightless, to capture the real in flight. But for me to use this marvelous camera only to reproduce the mimicry of actors, even those drowning in talent, would be completely senseless. I have consolidated a system, or better known as an anti-system, of no actors, no theatrics, no direction, disparity between performers and invented characters, the surprise of mistakes and instead of takes." So I guess it would be, this is way back in the 50s and 60s, but I guess what some people would define as essentially the kind of philosophy of using non-actors. But I think it's not just as simple as, we're going to use people from the town that we shoot the town in, but rather he would also tell his models to purposely not try to act, to not try to say the lines like and I say this in quote, the real character would say them. And that I guess the idea is that through their non-acting, through them saying the lines like as if they're just reading them off a paper, a kind of deeper truth, whatever truth means to you, emerges, and that a kind of a reality that we search for in art is expressed more than anything else. And, Kubrick kind of had similar ideas with how he would make the actors in his films do like 100 takes to take the acting out of them. But I guess Bresson, in a way, to me, is like smarter in that, fuck that. Let's not get actors. Let's get these non-actors and just tell them to read it off the page. Because, with Kubrick or something, isn't that essentially what he's trying to get them to do anyway? Mm-hmm. But, I mean, would you agree with
Yeah, that? I would say that, like, the natural, effortless, spontaneous moment that he's looking for is akin to something which also comes through all of his films, which is that concept of grace. It's like capturing what reveals the divine in the small mistakes, this fumblings of this animal-like
right.
quality that we are, without glorifying it, without without claiming that it has this meaning. It just has its meaning by itself and reveals divinity by itself through these natural mistakes or these effortless, spontaneous moments, human moments, human mistakes. That's where our divinity lies. And so he's about capturing grace.
Right.
And that grace is also this crushing thing that completely devours like our entire humanity, in which we're no longer human. We somehow like exist within that kind of like the omnipotent, all present like spirit or presence.
Yeah. And here's another quote about models that Bresson says to an interviewer when he was making Mouchette. "I didn't use any actors, even non-professional ones, but models, the way we think of the model for a painting or a sculpture. When I've made the right choice of model, the psychology happens on its own. I adjust myself in relation to it." The interviewer says, models, did you know what you just used the same word my friend used? Anyway, blah, blah. But Bresson says, "Cinematography is its own language. Both sound and image must be positioned in the editing with a precision measured by the millimeter." And then someone says, "Can we return to the question of cruelty?" Sorry, I'm kind of keeping going, but I think this is a great quote. Mouchette shows us the cruelty and misery we ordinarily choose not to see. Alhazar Balthazar was a protestation against cruelty, foolishness, and carnality. It's in me. I am in no way being didactic. I don't see myself righting wrongs. Cruelty is everywhere. In wars, torture, the camps, and young people who murder the elderly. In his letters, Oscar Wilde wrote something like, ordinary cruelty is just stupidity, a total lack of imagination. It's true that the lack of imagination leads to atrocity. At the beginning of the war, he means World War II, in the barracks, I watched a soldier skin a rabbit alive. I was terrified.
Ooh, I really like that quote, that Oscar Wilde quote.
Yeah.
It reminds me of this little piece in this book. It's actually the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, that's been interpreted by this guy named Jean-Yves Leloup.
Mm-hmm.
And he said something like kind of similar to what you just said, that, or at least that Oscar Wilde quote. And it says, there is no sin. It is we who continually create sin with our sickly imagination and then invent laws to make it more comfortable. It is our imagination that needs to be healed. We are responsible for the world in which we live, since it is we who create it. Our lack of enlightened imagination encloses that faculty in a death orientation that imposes limits upon it, wherein our feelings and intelligence have become arrested. And then it says, the imagination is the sympathetic resonance of the invisible and the visible, of the spiritual and the physical.
Hell, that's amazing. I love that. Yeah. So the writer and director, Paul Schrader, when he wrote Taxi Driver, was definitely influenced by Bresson, one of his earlier films, Pickpocket, and also probably Diary of a Country Priest, with the writing of diary passages and reading them aloud, though in the way that Travis does them. Schrader, in fact, wrote an entire book called Transcendental Style in Film, about Bresson, Ozu, and Dreyer. But the point, I guess, is that in a way, it's weird. It's like, of course, film nerds know who Bresson is, but the techniques he created in terms of like styles of editing and kind of the tools of filmmaking influenced a huge amount of what we know as modern film. But there's so much we could say about him, but I think to really begin, we should, like we've done in a lot of our previous episodes, is we go through the film and we talk about scenes, and we'll probably also stop sometimes to talk about the book, because the book, which was written first, has a much more I guess, meatier set of information. It's really, really amazing and beautiful and totally twisted in the best way, and so sad, and I think expresses feelings that everyone has had, but we'll get to that. Okay, so we're starting the film. The film begins with a kind of cold open with no titles. It's just like a room, and the character we will eventually know as Mouchette's mother says essentially two things. Do you want to talk about that, Amelia?
Yeah, she says, so she's sitting in a chair in church, and she's saying, what will become of them without me? And then she says, I can feel it in my breast. It's like a stone inside. And then she gets up and walks off screen. But the camera still lingers over the empty space where she was just sitting. And so this is her mother. She's in church, so it's like implying that this is her prayer in this desperate, kind of lonely state of
Mouchette's mother.
Yeah, Mouchette's
And
mother.
she's referring to her children, what will happen to my children when I die, and referring to
Yes.
her, the cancer in her breast, essentially.
Yeah, and when she's talking about I can feel it in my breast, it also represents this tremendous sorrow, you know, this great unknown, and this, you know, grief for what will become. And, you know, this very first scene is someone taking an exit. They exit the screen. We no longer see them. So Bresson is kind of describing death as an image in our mind, and then really what it is a disappearance of an image. And I feel like what makes him so different as like a filmmaker is that he could be considered a non-dualist.
And what's a non-dualist, so the people that don't know?
A non-dualist is, it's just it would be somebody who does not consider to be, or people to be, separate entities, but all is like encompassed by like a single consciousness, you could say. But I say that he could be considered a non-dualist because his model for consciousness or for God is pretty identical to those who speak about non-duality. Because so he models consciousness or God as this colorless, transparent screen upon which everything appears. And so that he like God is, in this case, like the empty screen, just the
frame that the mother's left.
Yes.
Right. And essentially non-duality, for some people, like a simplistic version of it might be like elements of Buddhism or something.
Right.
The film, after the credits, begins with this character, Matthew. I don't, it's the French Mathieu, who is a game warden, essentially. And he's following Arsène, who is a poacher, as he sets traps for game, like small game. None of this is in the book. The actual book begins with Mouchette going on her journey to eventually be raped after school. This film is different in that we get a lot of backstory to give us context to the kind of brutality that ends up existing for Mouchette. But I think there's plenty of connections we could have for the predator and prey kind of symbol of humanity, whether it's the game warden catching the poacher, or the poacher like going after a rabbit, or Mouchette being abused by all of the kind of French village. Do you have any thoughts on this opening?
The scene of these, what I guess they're quail or something,
Yeah,
being poached. It's like a what is it called? Like a foreshadowing of Mouchette, and so she is like the bird resembles her as this kind of hunted animal.
Yeah.
Just caught in kind of the
trap. The trap of Arsène later on. So we have these scenes, but then finally the film moves forward, and we eventually come upon the town's, like, what's the most important part of their little town, because they're all alcoholics in poverty, is the bar. And we see Mouchette and her older brother
Or Mouchette's father and older brother.
Right. What did I say?
Mouchette and her brother.
Oh, sorry. Mouchette's father and her older brother go to the town bar, deliver, I assume, some bootleg alcohol or like some, illegally carried over alcohol from some other country. And they get some free gin or whatever this is. And, I feel like Bresson here is just kind of setting the stage for this like very cold, simplistic, people go to the bar, they get their drinks. They don't even chat or talk. Nobody's happy.
Yeah, they're moving like automatons just through life. There's no joy at all in like any part of it. Mm-hmm. In like the way that you would think like, they're drinking this toast over them illegally bringing this alcohol to this bar.
Right.
But there's not any like cheer. There's no like there's no celebratory like feeling or just levity at all.
Right. And then we come upon Mouchette at home with her mother heating up, I guess, is that like maybe that's
it's a cloth.
A cloth for her mother's head, and her mother's dying of cancer. It seems like in the book, it's when Mouchette kind of discusses her life. She discusses the alcoholism of her father. She talks about being beaten by her father and the brutality of that and just kind of accepting it. And I think one thing the book and the film deals with, though, is she's like brutalized and savaged, but she has a kind of inner rebellion in her constantly, which the film kind of comes across too, I think, which is there's a kind of hatred for all of the society that goes against her. When I think of like another film like Welcome to the Dollhouse, where Dawn,
right, everybody knows this person,
right,
and like their behavior, their misbehavior, you could say, in school is kind of this reflection of how they're treated at home, and they have they lack this sense of self-value at all. There's they're not worth anything, not in their home, not to their parents,
not in the society,
never to society.
Right.
Your parents are the ones that's supposed to love you,
right. And same with Welcome to the Dollhouse. I'm sure some people think of Dawn as just a victim, but there's a lot of anger that exists within Dawn, whether it's her like cutting off Missy's or her little sister's Barbie head, or her like shooting a spit wad and then getting yelled at for fighting back. Like, what were you doing? I was fighting back. Whoever taught you to fight back? But
right.
Anyway, Mouchette.
Bresson describes her behavior as if she's an animal in defense.
Right.
That her actions, although they seem like this willfulness, is just this automatic act that is it's like what results from her entire conditioning. It's automatic. She can't help anything.
Yeah, I mean, anyway, in the book there, and we'll probably read a couple little passages from it, there's a lot of descriptions of her being brutalized or thinking of the brutality that happens to her, and a kind of confused anger and rebellion at wanting to get back at the world. So we have this scene of her brother and sister coming home, and the dad just basically passes out. Mouchette sleeps on the floor. Then we see the next day with Mouchette in class, and the children are singing.
Right. There's the book, as you read, it goes way more into the dynamics of her in school, and like, so Mouchette hates
her teacher.
She hates her teacher, but the class is like they make them sing. Mm-hmm. The girls all sing, and the teacher
like
plays this like harmonium, and so she despises music, mostly for I think what it represents to everybody else, and she just sees it as this total lie. And so this scene is so important. That all her classmates are singing along to the song while she's completely like silent.
Yeah, and the song,
looking down.
The song's like opening lyrics are hope is dead.
Yeah. So she refuses to sing. The teacher jumps across the room and starts demanding that she
sing the right notes or
yes.
sing it all. And in the book, maybe you could read this part, I don't know, but in the book, the mademoiselle essentially yells at Mouchette.
Yeah. So she says, "You're nothing but a little savage. A proper savage. Even savages have their music. A savage one, of course, but still music. Music comes before knowledge everywhere." Nevertheless, she had stopped trying to teach her scales. It was much too much of a waste of time, too upsetting. But Mouchette, who for some unknown reason insisted on speaking in her throat and exaggerating her horrible Picard accent.
Yeah.
So there's this part in the book that isn't here in the movie that I think is this beautiful description of her her teacher abusing her, essentially.
Right.
And so she's grabbing her in the book and demanding that she sing.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, Mouchette snaps out of it and goes into, she calls it a trance. She goes into this trance, and all of a sudden, she starts singing the proper note.
Mm-hmm.
And she said it was like almost like against her consent that
Right.
came out of her. And so it made me think of something that I kind of like saw recently, and it goes along with Bresson and his like comparison with animals to humans.
Mm-hmm.
In Alhazard, there's a part where the donkey is sold to the circus and taught math.
Mm-hmm.
And when I watched this part of Mouchette, or read that part in the book as well, it made me think of this thing that I saw recently about when people train elephants to do portraits or paints.
Mm-hmm.
They say, like, you know, like it may look like just this, like, elephant is just doing this with their own free will, but the training involved to get the elephant to actually do that is through like pain and torment.
Yeah.
And so the actual act of it is it's like this traumatizing thing that it goes against her autonomy.
Right. But and I think also though what's interesting though about that little thing from the book is that she says though that she would sing from her throat. To me, it almost reads like this little rebellion of like purposely singing the wrong way.
Right, because it's her willfulness.
Right.
Like everything is done without her consent.
Like
she has no autonomy.
But
Her only autonomy is
thing.
expressed.
And then on that point,
behavior.
I think the next major scene is after school. Mouchette waits in a ditch and throws dirt clods at the like little girls, whatever, not even popular, just students who hate her.
You should find this part in the book because it's actually like amazing.
Here it is. In the film, she's waiting by this, little ditch ravine and just throwing dirt clods. It's the first time you really see this, I don't know, this desire to like say to destroy. It's like a little animal in a cage screeching and yelling, even though they already know the end. They're determined. There's no kind of freedom or end that isn't, I guess, horrific, but Mouchette nonetheless despises her captors and her tormentors. She immediately walks around town and like the girls, treated, she threw the dirt clods at the girls, and then we immediately see a boy who like flashes her and calls her rat face. Yeah. And then Mouchette. Yeah.
I liked this description of her throwing mud at her schoolmates. She describes it like all Mouchette's pleasures. This one seemed to increase rather than diminish on each occasion, just as she picked up in the shadows, in the currents, 1,000 precious things which had lain unnoticed for years. She discovered this pleasure by chance also. So she just like, this is like, it describes it as like one of her only little vices. Like she gets more and more pleasure every time she like,
throws.
Yeah.
Right. And I think it's, interesting that that's how it begins in the book. Okay, so let's look at the difference. I think this is important now when we see the film. We get more backstory that isn't in the book, which is that there's this kind of, I assume, almost like weekend town life, which is the townsfolk who live in this bar. There's like this kind of weird side plot where Matthew, even though he's married, the game warden guy is obsessed with this bartender. I forgot what her name is, like Louisa or something. He's obsessed with Louisa and she doesn't like him, but instead Arsene likes Louisa. In a way, this stuff kind of doesn't matter as much. Mouchette, in the scene, is at the carnival. She gets a coin from some person who feels sorry for her, and she begins to go on the bumper cars.
Mm-hmm. So this scene is not in the book, but it's there's a parallel to it in the book that's not in the film either, but both represent the same thing. It's the only part in this entire movie that offers any levity at all. We actually see her smile. There's really like not really like another time where she expresses joy, or is really like allowed to.
Yeah.
And it's really like it's a fleeting like instant. So I wanted to compare this scene to something that's in the book. I described this scene as the open bottle top to this deep dark, like,
liquid or soda.
Yeah, like it's the only thing that lets light in or alleviates the film from being one-dimensional.
Well, because explain why. Because she's doing these bumper cars and there's a boy who's looking at her. She's smiling because he's kind of flirting with her on the bumper cars.
Yes. So it's like this fleeting moment when her spirit is like free, and she just gets this little taste of joy. And Bresson wrote, "I invented a fair and a boy for Mouchette to be drawn to. He appears and disappears like a phantom. The disappearance of hope doesn't always bring despair." And then he said, another reason, more obvious, why I added this was that the lightness and gaiety allowed the darkness that follows to be felt more strongly. So I also, I would describe this as like another little flash of grace. It does like give this contrast. It gives this more bleak contrast between the light and the dark. This like, impossible joy that she can't ever reach ever again. And so in the book, Mouchette describes the only experience of love that she's ever had. Here, do you want to read this?
Yeah, this is actually the end of the book, but it, like you said, it complements what the film doesn't have and vice versa. It says it happened one holiday time. She was taking back to Dumont's cafe the fish which the old man had caught during the day, a basket of eels. On the way, a big, fair-haired girl had bumped into her and turned her around and asked her name. Mouchette had not answered, and the girl gently and absent-mindedly stroked her cheek. At first, Mouchette had thought nothing of it, and indeed the memory had been painful until the evening, and she'd pushed it out of her mind. It had returned suddenly, changed and almost unrecognizable. Just before dawn, when she was asleep on the ragged mattress which Madame Dumont on events when the cafe was full, put down for her in a narrow corridor littered with empty bottles and cans and smelling sharply of sour wine and greasily of paraffin. In some strange way, while she was half asleep, she felt herself cushion her face in the crook of her arm and smell the imperceptible perfume of that warm hand. And indeed, She seemed to feel the hand itself so near and so real and living that without thinking she raised her head and put up her lips to be kissed. And then the next part says, this is from the introduction. Later, Mouchette looks at her own swarthy, calloused hand and is horrified. It is the sight of this hand that drives her into the blur of suicide. There's nothing in her drowning that is joyful or gives a feeling of spiritual liberation, but there is exhilaration, and once the inevitability has sunk in, a mild consciousness that grace is everywhere. Bernanos, like Bresson, exhibits sang-froid to the end.
Yes.
Well, what does sang-froid mean?
Oh, I don't know.
Should look it up. Sang-froid. Composure or coolness, sometimes excessive as shown in danger or trying circumstances.
Yeah, so it's an indifferent, it's like an, imperturbable peace, right?
Right.
So, it's saying, like, even this joyful moment, it all goes into, like,
including the
despair.
suffering.
Yeah.
Right, but despair exists the same as the one beautiful moment of joy. And Amelia talked about non-duality, which literally is that, grace is everywhere.
Yes.
And also thinking of the Catholicism of Bresson, which is that, like, suffering is divine and divinity is everywhere within suffering and joy.
Right. Bresson tries to, he explains this, like, thing that is impossible to describe about this, that everything, even your deepest sorrow in your heart, the deepest loneliness, it all is given up to God. And it happens naturally. It's not something like we can do with our own will. All of it is a will of God. It's something that's just happens to us.
Right. And I think that I love that quote from the book so much. But so essentially, though, in the movie, she has this moment of connecting with a boy on the bumper cars, and she kind of follows him, and then right when maybe she's about to actually talk to the boy, her father turns around and slaps her, and that moment of, like, human connection is just completely destroyed.
Yes. So it implies too, he's like a hawk, like watching her, waiting for her to do this, to then swoop down and take away, like, the thing that
one piece of joy that she has. But even in her tears, there's, I don't know, grace and divinity.
So right after this, her father gives her, like, she's sitting by them, they're all drinking. I kind of described, like, this, like, moment of her joy, this kind of connection that she might have had, like, with this boy, as this, like, fleeting, sweet and real moment. And then right after that is this taste of shame, and like, that you could kind of, like, say is like that bitter drink. Like, her father slaps her for either going on the ride or flirting with this boy, but it's not even, like, clear what she's being reprimanded for. And the mixing of those two experiences, like, merges in her mind, and it just kind of, like, solidifies as this, like, you're not allowed into this kingdom. You're forbidden from your joy. Yeah.
So moving on, like, there's just more drinking, more of
mud
throwing, and then this section of the film.
Yes, this is where she descends down the hill, away from where everybody else was going, into the woods after school. Right. Nobody sees her leave. She's all about hiding away from everybody.
Right.
So
it's where the book actually starts.
Yes.
Which is her descending onto this kind of adventure to be brutalized, but also, anyway, we'll get into it. And I think if you're watching along, I don't know if anyone ever does this, but you could watch along the movie with us. It's on the Criterion channel. The film is shot so simply, there's, everything's essentially a medium kind of shot. I think where it's not about crazy cinematography, to me, it's really in the performances and the editing, and I don't know, but ultimately it's that kind of philosophy of utilizing these models bears its fruit, or whatever you want to say. I think some people would maybe watch this movie and, I don't know, Bresson even talks about how some people say his films are so slow.
Well, yeah, we're there to suffer with her in all of these agonizing moments. They're drawn out, and he's never afraid of the silence and loneliness and emptiness. Mm-hmm. Because that's where we're meant to watch this movie with patience and an open heart. Mm-hmm. It's it would be impossible to watch it without being ready to share something with this character.
Right. I mean, Bresson says about the film, there's no action in my film. If there is action in any of my films, particularly in Mouchette, it is purely interior, right? Mm-hmm. It's like what I was saying, where the most beautiful parts are. Although his work with the soundtrack, not just the music, but the actual soundtrack is incredible, and it's you could make a video or a podcast about it by itself. But the quote finishes, "Much better to talk of precision than of action. When Mouchette's mother dies, nothing happens, no action in the sense of drama or plot. I've been told in no uncertain terms that the absence of action, that silence and slowness, pose great dangers to a film. In the vast majority of current films, music is used to combat silence and slowness." And I don't know. I think that's a great example of things I love and wanting to allow things to sit and to be.
Yeah.
Even,
If you notice, I think I read somewhere, it's either in that book right there, or he was just saying the difference between Alhazard, the thing that he corrected with this film, which he made right afterwards, mm-hmm. was that if you notice, in Alhazard, he plays the same song over and over and over again. Mm-hmm. He said he basically regretted that, and in this one there isn't any music. It's only at the beginning and then the very end.
Right. So the film has this subplot which exists at the end of the book too, with Arsene, or exists in the book with Arsene and Matthew, where they essentially have a fight over Arsene's poaching. They're both drunk as skunks, because actually the fight is about Arsene dating this girl that Matthew is obsessed with, even though she's much younger than him. And Arsene and Matthew have a fight, and Arsene believes he maybe killed Matthew, but we discover he was just kind of drunk and epileptic and blanked out what happened. In the film, Mouchette witnesses all of this. In the book, she's told this information about the fight. Yeah. So... I think one thing that's really interesting is, Bresson was obsessed with, sound mixing and making sure the sound mixing was really at the forefront of also his thoughts. Bresson says in this interview, sound mixing for me is truly a creative act. It's the moment when all of the film's elements, sound and visual, are put in contact with one another, or acting upon one another, and become transformed. In this conception of cinematography art, which is unlike the one based in mimicry, gestures, and actorly effects, the image track and the audio track are of equal importance. he goes on in this interview book all about sound mixing, and it's incredible, especially people like us that love noise and essential and lots of sound editing and sound mixing. It's interesting. A filmmaker we love so much is also obsessed with that.
Yes. He said he took 40 different audio samples of wind for the cyclone scene.
Yeah, and in the making of, there's actually a making of documentary for Mouchette if you have the Blu-ray, and it shows them like doing sounds of like creaky, gates and all kinds of stuff, and you can tell he's obsessed. Anyway, he's a nerd like us.
He also says something like the image goes outward, and the sound goes inward.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So especially with this, to me, this fight with Arsène and Matthew happens, and then Arsène comes upon Mouchette in this rainstorm alone in the woods at night.
She's lost her clog.
Right.
Which is a big deal because she's
so poor that she has no other shoes.
In the book, she explains she can literally sense how she's going to be beaten when she gets home.
Right.
Because she's
lost. Yes.
She also lost something that belonged to her. It's like a scarf.
Yes.
To, her whole family.
And this opening shot of Mouchette being discovered in the torchlight by Arsène is weirdly sexual because she's pulling up a long stocking. Yeah.
She's all wet.
Yeah. Yeah.
And has little pigtails in her school outfit.
Right. Yeah. The actress of the film, I believe, was 18, but was chosen because she looked younger.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Arsène says to her, "If you go home without your clog, you'll get hell."
Right. In the book, it's very clear how much he's manipulating her step by step with everything that he's saying.
To eventually rape her. Right.
Yeah.
In the movie, it's a little more
he's kind
unsure.
It's he's kind of, Bresson just shows his innocence above all things. Even if he isn't innocent, if he's not a bad person, everything that he's doing is as automatic as an epileptic seizure. Yeah.
This kind of determinism of no control of the will.
Yes.
Which Bresson and many people are obsessed with. That Mouchette, Mouchette's in this weird, it's like a hut, which I think is interesting. It's like these old French towns, and all these people have these homemade huts for, I assume, hunting. He immediately gives her some gross rot gut alcohol to drink. In the book, she mentions more that it's really gross on her stomach. It feels awful to drink it.
She hasn't eaten anything all day, and she's all wet. I mean, she looks really uncomfortable.
Right. So essentially, he kind of interrogates her. He tells her, don't tell people that you saw me in the woods. Tell them you took this road and that you were looking for lost candy or something, or you wanted to buy stuff.
He gives her money, and in the book, it's
that's
the most money she's ever held in her hand.
Clearly, he's planning something. He's being nice to her for some strange reason. But in the book and in the film, Mouchette has an
affinity.
Yeah, an affinity and a sympathy, empathy for Arsène, even though he's kind of viewed as this town scumbag,
Well, no wonder, she's treated like such shit from everybody. So you would see somebody like that and kind of respect their autonomy, their own way,
Right, because he goes his own way, and he's also, people are disgusted with him. She looks up to him in this way of being this fellow outsider, but as we'll see, she eventually gets raped by him. He is manipulating her the whole time, but as we watch, we'll see that and hear that she, although she hates being raped and I don't think enjoys it, she refuses to give him up to the authorities. In fact, she embraces and loves him. I don't know. What would you say?
So this is like a kind of a Christ story, you could say. And, you know, she loves arson like Jesus loved Judas, you know. And in the end, it's very like traditional that, you know, it goes that Jesus kissed Judas, knowing that, like, you know,
would
he
betray
was
him.
Yes, and so it's like that. Like, she loves him in
Arson.
this way, yeah, unconditionally, and there's nothing he can do to betray her in that sense.
Right. She will love him even though.
Well, she's the only, like, she's deprived of love and understanding, and in a way, through this silent, like, through their interaction together, he shows her that he trusts her, he confides in her. She feels understood. She feels like not understood in the sense that he's interested in her. She's receptive to him. She's listening to him. She's his confidant, you know?
Right. So in the film, or as we're watching it, there's a lot of action that's like her sitting down, sitting by the fire, him throwing at ashes, and there's a kind of like going through the motions of these simplistic...
Feels like a crime already.
Right. Minimal actions. There's the acknowledgement of the bite. He has a bite on his hand that Matthew gave him from their fight. Pretty soon, he mentions that there's a cyclone, of which there isn't, but it's clearly a way to I mean, in the book, it seems like a way to clearly manipulate. He says, there's a tornado. Mouchette, you can't go home. You need to stay with me. In the book, it seems clear that he's trying to manipulate her to rape her. In the movie, to me, I always almost read it as like Matthew is kind of, Arson is out of it and kind of thinks that maybe there is a cyclone.
In the book, it kind of does say that
they're unsure.
He's like, he suffers from like
Epilepsy.
So he even talks about, like, sometimes I just go completely blank and forget everything. I mean, that could be a manipulation. We don't really know.
Right.
It could be that he's manipulating her with pretending that he had this lapse of memory and that he, like, needs her help. Or it could be true, you know?
Right. So here, as it goes, they drink a little more, and then they speak. What does she say? Let's see. So Arson's saying, like, look, I think I murdered this guy. You know, will you have my back if they question you about, you know, where I was tonight? He's getting more and more wasted and desperate. She's looking down on him as he sits. She's this, in a way, he's begging her. And
well, she's more coherent than
he
for
is
sure too. So they're trying to get this, like, story straight. She has no problem with it. It's all him, like, not being able to, like, piece these things together, and he's just trying to, like, come up with something.
Yeah. He explains, like, his version of this fight. Arson's about to have an epileptic seizure, and Mouchette is trying to help him get his story straight, trying to help him and support him, which is, I think, the most important thing. He falls and has a very violent seizure in the book and in the film. She watches him and kind of tries to take care of him best he can. In both senses, Mouchette has been abused and treated like garbage, and in this context, she's the one who is that person to help the wounded person. And I was, like, thinking of the book, and it seems like she's in the book. her inner monologue seems to be very confused about, what she's doing. I think, like, ultimately it seems like in the book she doesn't fully understand why she feels bad for him as he's having this seizure, but and then she sings to him, and singing reminds her that she might actually be a good singer.
I think Mouchette, it's like this moment when she finds something to live for. It's something that she feels. She doesn't feel numb. And then there's like this kind of idea that she's useful for something. That she has purpose.
Right. That the song that she was kind of
forced to learn.
And that she was punished for singing incorrectly. Now she sings the song and can heal someone and hold and caress the head of somebody who's had this seizure. But as we see, then begins like a chase in the film where she eventually gets raped.
Here is a part of the book. It's Mouchette describing. She's basically
thinking back on her rape.
Yeah, this is right after it happened. Thank you. Those girls are lucky in whom their first sexual experience arouses remorse, or at least some emotion violent enough to overcome the formless anguish and desperate nausea which Mouchette felt. She made a pathetic effort to think about her banal adventure, but managed only to accelerate the process of wild images that flowed through her brain. It was like one of those endless nightmares of uniform horror which, as a real alcoholic's daughter, she often had to endure throughout a whole night, and whose full memory only really came back much later, at supper time, when she had carried it with her all day like an invisible animal attached to her body.
Yes. Oh my God, that's so beautiful. I mean, that's why the book, I think, is so important to read. But I think all of that subtext is also seen in the film. In the film, her rape isn't shown. It's just Arsène chasing her, and then she falls on like a bundle of sticks for the fire in the hut they're in. And then, so in the film, it's an incredible section from the book, and it's so important because you kind of see this inner working of Mouchette. In the film, of course, it doesn't have that exact thing, but I think that piece comes through in the models or the actors when what they don't say. But in the actual narrative of where we're at, Mouchette is running from Arsène. Finally, she loses the fight, the chase, and is pushed on a giant bundle of firewood, of sticks, and is essentially, this was shot in the 60s, so it just shows him on top of her. But I think one of the most important elements is as she struggles, she finally embraces him. And the implication, of course, is there's that part of her that not only she despises that she's been raped, she hates and is confused by what's happened to her, but she also, I think, loves Arsène for his representation as a outsider and rebel within their society and their town, and also this person that she had this semi-positive experience with, although not as positive as true happiness. Mm-hmm. I don't know. It's complicated though, and that's why I love this film.
Yeah, I have something to add from. What is this? This little.
It's an essay.
Essay that's included in
the Blu-ray.
The Blu-ray. It says, for Mouchette, love, sex, empathy, service, humiliation, and force are all bound up together. Although a child, she functions as caretaker for her family, yet she is an unseasoned, lackadaisical steward, spilling coffee and milk and sloppily swaddling her baby brother. Her response to her mother's death is to fall asleep. Bernanos renders Mouchette's encounter with Arsène as a continuation of the cruelty she suffers at home. In her child's mind, the memory of that violence was somehow mixed with that of many others, and her reason could scarcely distinguish it from her father's savage beatings. But Bresson's bleaker vision here always sees double. He deftly affirms arson as an alternative to her domestic violations, as well as their latest installment. Arson manifestly wishes to protect Mouchette, even as he attacks her. She identifies with Arson's troubles and his revolt, hugging him finally while he struggles on top of her.
Right. And I love this essay so much. We already read a little bit from it, but it's by a writer named Robert Polito. Side note. Mouchette, after being raped, is let go and arrives home.
She has to run away from him and hide on the road.
True. Right. In the book, she just specifically describes like him falling asleep essentially and her running from him, and he even chases her.
Yes. And when she hides, she's like hiding in this bush like one of those quails or something. She just looks like another prey, game, right? You know. Yeah.
And so we return back to her house while her mother is dying, and the baby's just been like wetting itself. That's described in the book. It's covered in cloth diapers that are wet. She gets some milk that.
Just to be clear, like her mother cannot move around.
Right. So this baby's just been lying there crying all night, and Mouchette finally comes home and tries to like warm up this milk.
By the way, I just wanted to say like the opening of this, when she returns home, she steps inside and her mother is like, "Where have you been?" And instead of her being in trouble, she notices like her mother just quickly is like, "You need to help me. Right. You need to help me."
But in both contexts, yeah,
both contexts. Right. So there's like no room. What just happened to her is not able to be processed. She's going straight into being a caretaker for her family.
Right. She
there's no space for her to think. She's just like automatically going through these.
This
movements.
Isn't someone saying, "Mom, this is what's happened to me." In the in some senses, like, oh, this person's about to die, so she can't say it. But to me, it's like a metaphor for like the life of so many people in misery and poverty and whatever situation they're in. It feels like they can never express this horrible trauma that's been put upon them. And, Mouchette heats up a bottle, and I notice in the book and the film it mentions it's cold milk, and she tries to heat it with her like
she can't
chest.
find any matches in the book because her father just took them out of the house
to smoke.
Her father just doesn't give a fuck.
Right, he's an alcoholic, right? And like she tries to heat. She has no breast really because she's so young, but she tries to heat up the bottle on her chest. And in the film, she almost opens her shirt up to feed the baby, even though she's using a bottle, and she cries. And this is the only moment of herself to really kind of express some pain for what's just happened to her. But I think it's interesting that the pain of, maybe this is an obvious image, but the pain of the woman who must sit with her rape, but then also feed the baby. Right? Like, isn't it like this encapsulation? I know I'm a man saying this, of like parts of womanhood.
So I only know this because of referencing parts of The Diary of a Country Priest. But it's basically like he tries to push this understanding on us that like after something like this happens, like these terrible things just over and over happen, they just deplete the person of their happiness, that thing that they could connect to for joy. And so like they just close themselves off from the world, from love at all. And then like what happens is just this like this you're then gonna just live. You just have to keep living on, and there's nothing you can do about that. Like life continues. There's no like quality in it.
There's no respite out of the misery.
And so that the baby and the mother carrying on and like all of this is just this like, this is like what you have to face.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, but
you can't escape this.
But just to me, the image though of like Mouchette crying as she has just had this horrific violence committed against her sexually, and then has the baby that she has to like give love to, even though it's not her baby. I don't know. It's just an incredible image.
I think Bresson, when he is focused on Mouchette crying, holding the baby, nobody's there to comfort her. She's all alone, and in a sense, like, her tears are the only way that she's comforted.
Right.
She's comforted internally by God. God is reaching out and stroking her cheek. It's the only way that
which
has,
is that
it's her only comfort.
That God is everywhere. God is in your suffering, and even the inverse of love is divine.
Yes.
And okay, so let's move on to this beautiful shot of Mouchette's mother lying in bed. It's just a medium shot of her in bed by lamplight. Another beautiful shot of Mouchette close up in shadow, crying over the baby again. Her tears, they really went all out with the fake tears.
They did.
The tears are literally falling on the baby's face and hands.
It's the only exaggerated quality of this film.
Right. I mean, it's like it's this. It seems outwardly like special effecty, but it's a great effect. Whatever. The mother just simply says there's cloth on the line and that the baby needs to be changed. The mother is like dying, and all she notices and talks about in the book too is the baby's wailing. And this another kind of metaphor for all of existence, of like literally being like tortured and in pain while you have to deal with this screeching of like the new life, that is all around you.
Yeah.
So Mouchette wipes her tears, and I feel like it's okay. This is what's interesting. In the book, you can tell there's maybe parts that she wants to tell her mother what happened. In the movie, there's many different shots of her just like staring off into space with the...
She falls asleep and wakes up.
Right, and the mother's
This
like,
is
"Why are
when
you standing there?"
She woke up crying.
Right, and her mom is essentially like, "You're not doing what you should be doing." So we're at a part of the film where Mouchette's mother's dying, asking for some water, or actually gin. Sorry, for like gin that she shouldn't even touch. The father's such an alcoholic. That's like the hidden backup gin for his alcoholism.
Mouchette has to put water in it to make it look like none of it has been drink. So, and
the mother is drinking this because the pain is so bad, and but I think the book has some beautiful passages if you want to read them.
So she says, "Give me the bottle again. Why shouldn't I? I've gone my whole life without. I may as well have a bit of pleasure while I'm dying. It's not dying that upsets me. All my life I've had to do what I was told. Grumble or don't, just as you want, but do as you're told or you'll catch it. It's always like that for us. It's our fate. Well, from now on, I'm going to do as I like." She absently caressed the bottle with her left hand. It was so pale that the furrows and wrinkles looked back, like writing in India ink on white paper. "What if I don't die tonight? Remember what I'm going to tell you, Mouchette. Go and get the doctor. I've been dying to see him for days, to talk to him. I can't explain why. I'm not blaming you, but all of you have brought me nothing but pain. There's something to be said for nice people. They're not like us. You'll go get him for me, Mouchette, won't you? Tell him to come in the evening because of your father. He wouldn't be very nice to him. You'll tell him, won't you, Mouchette?" "Yes, Mom, I'll go. And you don't get taken in by any idlers and drunkards. A girl might fall for them, but you see there's Mr. Arson as well. You're too young. You don't understand. He's not the sort of man your father should know." She stretched out her hand for the bottle like a blind woman. "Just one swallow. just one, my poor dodo. I feel hollow inside, as if I didn't weigh any more than a feather cushion. Gently, almost shyly, she laid her rough hand on her daughter's head, seeming to apologize for her tenderness, which must have seemed strange to the girl, from whom she had been told to draw no word of pity. For an instant, the stubborn little head resisted imperceptibly, and then sank slowly onto the mother's breast, yielding, as if at the end of its strength, with a faint, weary moan. Mom, she began, I must tell you something. Her mother was dead and heard nothing.
Yeah, God, it's
the implication is that she actually confessed to her mother the entire thing, because it's like, I must tell you something, ...
Right.
She went on and on.
The film does the same thing too, where it's like it cuts after she says that, implying that she must have said something and then went to sleep, but her mother heard none of it. She was dead.
Yeah.
It also, I hate to like just talk about a random different book, but it made me think of one of my favorite books, Last Exit to Brooklyn. At the end of that book, it's a chapter that basically describes the inner workings of this tenement, and it's the ending is one of my favorite endings, and I just wanted to quickly read a couple lines from it because it beautifully reminded me of it, which is that a woman gets beaten by her husband, and the mom, she crawled out to the kitchen and pulled herself up, holding on to the edge of the sink, still yelling that he was a bastard, and then let the cold water run over her head. Her daughter came over to help her, and Nancy continued yelling, and then the frustration started her crying, and her daughter told her not to cry. Jesus loves us, Mommy. Nancy told her to get the fuck away from her. Abraham slept. I'm sorry for bringing that up. I know it's different, but to me, there's a kind of... I love that passage so much. This kind of unanswered prayer, or I guess specifically in Last Exit to Brooklyn, it's like people hurt that end up hurting each other. But I think what's interesting is later in both the book of Mouchette and the film, after the father and brother come home and see Mouchette's mother dead, there's a section of the book that describes, the father almost looking pitiful and sad, and almost looking at his daughter with a kind of shame and connection of like, your mother's dead, my wife is dead. But then he's disgusted that Mouchette's staring at him, that maybe she's trying to connect with her father, and he calls her a little hussy and she yells shit at him. It reminded me of Last Exit to Brooklyn, in that there's a kind of desire for the daughter desires to connect with the mother after they've been abused by their father. But in the end, there's a rejection by both of this kind of connection, that they would rather be apart than together, even though in the end, like, we all are one thing together. Grace and all of us, we are connected, but there's this kind of other side to it. Sorry, I know that was a long thing, but I think it's okay. So now we're kind of getting towards the end. In the book, it's about 50 pages worth. In the end of the film, it's only about the last 10 minutes or so. But Mouchette kind of ritualistically goes to tell members of the village her mother's dead. And
she's not telling them. Everybody knows already.
Right. Sorry, you're correct. But she goes up to them, I guess. Mm-hmm. She first goes to a bakery. In the film,
she hasn't eaten anything,
right? But she's super hungry, and in the film, this baker woman gives her some coffee and some croissants to keep as like an act of charity, some day-old croissants or whatever they are. She like kind of desperately eats, and because she's so hungry and starving, but then ends up accidentally dropping this coffee bowl or coffee mug, and is essentially called a little rat by everybody. So Mouchette is handed like an extra little roll, and then this woman notices that she has a bruise on her breast, essentially, and this other woman notices it. And they, in the book, they more explicit about it, but she the way she looks at her is like, you're a slut. It isn't like, did you get raped? It's like, you're a little hussy who's like a slut.
Bresson says, it's the looks that kill.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. This judgment by the entire town. Like, there's a moment of, oh, we're doing the right thing. Your mother died, even though we all hate you. Here's a couple extra rolls. And then, not, are you okay? What happened to you? You're 14 years old. Why would you have bruises on your, breast area? And then Mouchette is freaked out and breaks this glass. And everyone's just like, you're fucked. Like, we knew you were always bad. No, but the woman calls her a slut in the film, which is, just brutal. And Mouchette just keeps walking.
She throws away the
croissant that was given. Is this kind of bullshit sympathy, like to say, like, I want no part in whatever you give me. She keeps moving forward.
Well, it makes me think of like that, like the whole concept of this village, like the concept of charity. It's so twisted because it's like all these people are going like to church,
but they're looking at her and judging her in the film. They're staring at her, not because
they
her mother's died,
her as well, and. Basically, I think it's weird that she's blamed for everything. She's responsible. It's like nothing that she's done at all. Like she's completely just has no control at all.
Right. She sees the boys again, the ones that flashed her, and they call her rat face.
The vibe that I get from this part of the movie right after her mother dies, and it's the next day, after she's slept like a little bit, but everybody knows. Right. Everybody knows that both her mother is dead and that she and Arson had
something weird happened.
Yes.
Yeah. So now she realizes through a window that Matthew isn't dead, like Arson thought. She had this whole story to protect him in case there was a murder, and Matthew's not dead. Arson was wasted and didn't know that he didn't die.
In this part in the book, like it shows in the film, she's horrified. She didn't realize that Matthew would even be there. So in her way, she just had this morbid curiosity just to go and see for herself.
Right. In the book, it seems like she, actually, I don't know. It doesn't seem I read it wrong. I didn't think she was as horrible. I guess there's a part in the book where she screams that she wants Matthew to stay to talk to her. I don't know if it's in the movie.
It is. I think it is.
Essentially, Matthew's wife knows something bad probably happened to her, aside from her mother just dying. And again, there's this kind of sympathy and care, like, okay, we're going to help this girl. Matthew interrogates her, trying to find out where Arson is. He was arrested, but essentially Mouchette still defends him. She has an alibi for him. In the book and the film, this doesn't matter, but Arson gets arrested because people claim that he was seen dynamiting a stream to poach the fish from the stream, but actually he couldn't do it because he was raping Mouchette. Of course, he doesn't want to admit that, but Mouchette still defends him by saying, no, he was really with me. He wasn't dynamiting the stream or whatever. Of course, Matthew's like, why were you, hanging out with Arson all night? And she was saying, oh, there was rain last night. I was afraid of the rain. That's why I was with Arson all night. And he doesn't really believe her, even though what she's saying is essentially true in some parts, that, she was afraid. And
so
there's just a kind of long conversation.
And then she claims Arson as her lover.
Right. She essentially says, like, no, I wasn't raped. There was nothing weird. He's my lover. And I'm sure to some people that watch the film, they're horrified or disgusted when, to Mouchette, this kind of interrogation of why would I give up Arson? he's an outsider, like I'm an outsider.
Yeah.
He is pain and disgust at this whole system, all these people, and so I defend him. It's very Christ-like.
Yeah.
But in the truest sense of like, I love the ones that hurt me. I identify or connect. I don't know. Maybe that's too simple. In the book, I think I'm hopefully reading the section correctly. Let's see. No thought of the man who had seized her and whose crude and childish fear she had shared for a night crossed her mind. In such a crisis, anger or shame, with their consequent desire for revenge, might have taken the place of hope for her. But her imagination was too sensual and violent to pass beyond the present. And now more than ever, the future was a meaningless word for her. The terrible and inexorable sense of futility, which has tormented so many perceptive and ardent men, and has been on rare occasions the instrument of their on so many rare occasions the instrument of their salvation. Rare because, like the serpent of the legend, or perhaps as the serpent of the legend, it is destructive, was still not clear in her mind. It had escaped somewhere inside her, like a mine exploding in the depths of the sea, where the sound of the explosion is muffled, but the surface of the water is disturbed. The watchful, caressing hatred which escapes from hell, and which is the same temptation, spreads its charm insidiously among the rich and powerful of this world, but can only take possession of the very poor by surprise, for they carry the sacred sign of their poverty. It spies on them day after day, terrible and watchful, and perhaps in secret terror. But once they have been induced to despair, the defenses of simple and irretrievably breached, and their ignorance knows no escape save suicide. I know I was getting a little ahead of myself, but I just really think in the book the description of that is so complex, of trying to explain the feeling that Mouchette feels towards what happened to her by arson. And it says, in such a crisis, with their consequent desire for revenge might have taken the place of hope for her, where like but her imagination was too sensual and violent to pass beyond the present. It's full of like what makes us human, which is like not understanding what we want or who we are, but there's a desire to not just see what happened to her as awful, even though she does see it as awful, but it represents kind of a desire for what she wants and what she'll never have. I don't know, What do you think? Do you like that quote?
I do. I think like it felt like I like that kind of thing. Like it's this thing that's barely understood in its surface level, but actually the understanding lies, or the trauma you could say lies within like the body taking in that thing. Like she's describing it's like a bomb that's like gone off under the depths of
I love
like,
that
the ocean.
Yes.
And like how it only reaches the surface like on these kinds of vibrations, which just it's like shock waves. Right. It's not processed.
Right. And then it makes me think of Bresson and his style with models, which is that these intense, things we can barely put into words, the way they're seen physically may seem like a simple bubble over the ocean.
He said he like Bernanos, the writer, are both against psychology and analysis as like explaining this. It is exactly like that description. It's just this subtle thing that speaks for itself.
Right.
You can't read it on the surface.
Right. There's no, if this was some awful soap opera, there'd be Mouchette going, I hate, arson, but I also feel this strange like kinship with him, and maybe that's our shared connection.
There's no way. Again, he said the thing that Bernanos's books are about more than solitude is in an incommunicability. So I would say that is for like the inside of your, like Mouchette can't process these things. They're ineffable.
Right.
There's no way that her mind can even fit this in. It's all like it's all so loose and like kind of just, I don't know, has like it, her body and her mind have like a will of its own, but it's all being like affected by what's happening to her and what has happened to her in the past.
There's another good line. It's like, until her chance meeting with Arson, she had never, despite such fleeting moments, had been able to overcome the strange rebellion against tenderness which made her so solitary. But as a hidden injury to the nervous system may cause pain so far away from the injury as to baffle the surgeon, now that the memory of the unknown girl and her caress had almost disappeared from Mouchette's mind, she began to examine her own hands. Sorry, that also connected to the book version of The Moment of Happiness, but I just like, saying the until her chance meeting with Arson, she never been able to like overcome that strange rebellion,
that resistance of care and receptivity, because I've processed the same information like before in my own way of just being like, our conditioning, everything that happens to us hardens our heart and closes us off. And so like even receptivity and to care of others is weaponized against yourself. It only causes more pain. So it's like it's better to just completely avoid all contact, avoid the even being open to receiving.
Right.
And
she did that. She sang something that she actually does love. She sang to Arson and she caressed him before being but anyway, do you want to keep moving forward?
Yeah.
She says like, no, he's my lover, and she runs off. And then here's the final kind of like woman who's this kind of old solitary not hag, but like old crone lady.
So like Bresson pointed out that like the three women that she meet, like the terrible women, are the lady from the cafe, that guy Matthew's wife. It's weird because it's like exactly what we were talking about just a second ago about like avoidance of care.
Right.
That lady, like Matthew's wife, was actually like concerned. She's kind of the only person that was like, no, stay here, let us be alone so you can talk to me about what happened to you. And she was like, I do not want to be alone with this lady. Right. This lady's care and receptivity, she,
it's interesting.
She couldn't deal with that.
It's weird though. Also, I was thinking about there's 3 women that she sees and then leaves and kills herself. Spoiler. And there's the 3 fates from Greek mythology.
Yeah.
Which is like the spinner, the old woman, the Elater, and the inflexible, and they spin the thread of human fate and dispense it and cut the thread of death. And I don't know. I'm sure that there's a connection there with mythology.
Absolutely is.
And I feel dumb for not seeing it sooner.
No, me too. That's a good point because the Maya is that spinner,
Right.
And she weaves the entire story. So
right.
There's this kind of like complex idea of like resentment against the creator. And that happens to be kind of like this female woman kind of, or like entity.
Yeah.
Because it's like it is the creator, the mother like figure, like that which creates everything. And
right.
In a way it goes back to Christianity where it's like the mother sacrifices her son to God or whatever. Like birth is just this sacrifice of life. Like whatever is born will die. We'll live this life of suffering. And so we come to like resent the mother. We resent like that figure,
right?
Like what these women represent,
right? So that's what's interesting. Like for all of them, she despises them and hates, for some for good reason and some for bad. And but in this last one in the book, this old woman just kind of goes on and talks like purposely. The Bernanos like writes long kind of rambling passages of this old lady talking about watching a woman die. Well, she was a watcher.
Yeah.
And but in the book. In the movie, it's a little bit shorter, but Mouchette purposely like digs her dirty clogs into her nice rug, and she's like saying like the old woman still says like, I just want to help you, but she says there's evil in your eyes. I think in the book she has a little more sympathy, but maybe I'm wrong. But she's, she gives her this dress to like wear to her mother's funeral, basically, is my implication. Yeah, in the book it's much longer, this kind of long thing. So finally Mouchette in the film watches hunters killing a rabbit, and contemplates and decides to drown herself. She's like horrified by the dying and tortured rabbit, the cruel world that like hunts its prey. In the book, again, we see her inner monologue considering suicide. And there's a beautiful, beautiful passage about the act of suicide. Would you read it? That passage?
Yes. People generally think that suicide is an act like any other, the last link in a chain of reflections, or at least of mental images, the conclusion of a supreme debate between the instinct to live and another more mysterious instinct of renouncement and refusal. But it is not like that. Apart from certain abnormal exceptions, suicide is an inexplicable and frighteningly sudden event, rather like that kind of rapid chemical decomposition which currently fashionable science can only explain with absurd or contradictory hypothesis.
That's so spot on and sad.
That's what Bernanos wrote.
Right.
He like that last part's confusing, but he goes and says like her love and her suicide all the same is as controllable as a seizure. Mm-hmm. So it's not like this, like the way we think of it as like this debate. It's of like this weighing between the will to live finally falling under a greater will that overcomes that. In fact, if everything, like Bernanos and Bresson says, if everything is grace, then this too is just one wave in the ocean of the absolute. It's as controllable as the weather.
There's back to the essay by Robert Polito. He says Mouchette tries twice to tell her mother about what happened to her with arson, that each time she stops she's interrupted by crying and death from her mother. Because of her suicide, Mouchette's life is another interrupted story, and Bresson doesn't show us an image of her body entering the water to drown, recording instead the sounds of her splash. Back to the amazing sound recording. The song Magnifique, what is it? That the ending song returns as the camera lingers. We're going to be playing it, or you might have already heard it, over the space that she, like her mother at the start of the film, has now vacated, an empty frame. Once again, we might view this as Mouchette's release, the suicide, as a gift. But if her death is akin to grace, Bresson never lets us forget that her suicide is also desperate, pathetic, and a dead end. Which, the film has been nothing but these kind of dual meanings of...
It's paradoxical stuff. Yeah.
That in life, grace is everywhere, suffering is close to divinity, and the tormentors can also be the ones that release it. The ones that hurt us the most can give us a kind of connection to beauty, but then also like the end of a life, Mouchette is released of suffering, but she also never got to live fully, and it is this tragedy. What did you want to say?
I'll just read a little bit of like the end
Of the book.
Suicide really only frightens those who are never tempted by it, and never will be, for its darkness only welcomes those who are predestined to it. The man with murder in his heart will only become aware of suicide at the last moment, unless he is mad. The last feeling of a person who kills himself must be one of amazement and desperate surprise. Apart from madmen, whose law is not our law, no one tries to kill himself twice. When she came close to it, the water was clear. The silt on the bottom was of a greenish gray color, as gentle to the eyes as velvet. But the voice which Mouchette could hear was infinitely more gentle. Was it a voice? She listened to it like a dog listening to his master as he encourages and pacifies him. It was like the old woman's voice, but also like Arson's, and now and again, even like Madame's. It spoke no human language. It was nothing more than a dying, whispering murmur. Then it was silent. Mouchette slid down the bank until she felt the gentle sting of cold water on her leg and as far as her thigh. Then sudden silence inside her seemed infinite, like that of the crowd as it holds its breath when the trapeze artist reaches the top rung of the ladder. Her will dissolved. She slid out into the water, pushing against the bank with one of her hands. She could hold herself up in the shallow water by the pressure of one hand on the bottom. Then she twisted over and looked up into the sky. She felt the insidious flow of the water along her head and neck, filling her ears with its joyful sound. She knew that life was slipping away from her, and the smell of the grave itself rose to her nostrils.
Wow. And like conversely, in the film, we're going to play this clip. We just see Mouchette go into the water, and there's like a loop of like a water ripple, and this beautiful music plays that started the film. So we'll play that clip right now. You heard the clip. That's the only actual music soundtrack in the whole film, this one piece. Mm-hmm. Before we end, there's a couple thoughts that we have about different things. And one interesting thought I had is Amelia and I were watching the film last year. We always watch it and every couple months. And I was looking up reviews and analysis of Mouchette and any kind of Bresson work, and I saw this essay. It's like by somebody who I won't name, but like, you know, someone clearly put a lot of thought into it. But it's essentially an essay that says, like, you know, Bresson and Bernanos are creating these kind of like Mouchette is this mechanical fantasy instrument, like a robot who these men create their little fetishistic toy to watch play out this sad game, and that their theory, and I guess you would define it as a Marxist theory. I don't say that in any kind of pejorative sense. I would assume the person who wrote the essay identifies himself as a Marxist critic. Is that the film should have instead be what should happen to Mouchette, which is, why don't we show Mouchette getting out of her poverty, or telling someone that she was raped, or leaving this town and finding some freedom and autonomy within her life. And the like essay just completely upset me because, number one, art doesn't always have to be what we wish life was. It's this piece, both the book and the film, are pieces about the way life is for many people. And it's a film, but to me, it's not just some like nihilistic piece about nothing. It's a piece about trying to find connection within all people, including people that fucking rape you, and and trying, and it's not as simple as like, oh, I love my rapist. But the complexity of humanness is, to me, shown bare. And it just, I know someone guys thinking like, Rusty, who cares about what one guy thinks, which is interesting because I told this to Amelia and she was like, don't read essays like this, but she had her own thoughts about the piece.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, this just comes from what you were saying kind of like before we recorded this. I'm just going off of kind of like what you've been saying. With the right set of beliefs, like this is what maybe like this point of view is kind of like, this is what I see in it, is like with the right set of beliefs and correct perception of the world, this will give us an empowered way of living. And so in a way, like what I've said is like, it's a kind of rejection of reality at its most transparent and cruel and atrocious. And, you know, as long as we like, we'll never be able to face it like that or look at it if we prefer to like live in this delusional way. I think that this kind of thing is like blind to real human suffering. And I think in their eyes, I would say like they probably like believe that human suffering is like a disease that can be cured. But
and that art, essentially Bresson is a fetishist who wants to play with women. And what's weird to me is like, I think I don't understand why if you see something, there's always going to be sex and death connected. And like, as dark as this may sound, like I don't think that, you know, Bresson was like this pedophile wanting to like sadistically watch Mouchette suffer. I really don't believe that. You know, someone who I think is interesting in that sense would be like Alan Robbe-Grillet, who made these films, these kind of postmodern pieces about the irrationality of life, but also would have Alan Robbe-Grillet would create these pieces about irrationality and absurdity and, you know, subjectivity in existence and in art. And he also would have his female characters bound in S&M kind of gear constantly, or like trapped. And it's very clear that Grillet is like, has a hard dick when he's creating this art. So once everything is very like clean and academic to a certain degree, but at the same time full of like hot-bloodedness. You know, when I watch, I'm not denying that Bresson, specifically in Alcazar Balthazar, probably thought his models were attractive, but I think that to simply see it as a dirty old man putting women in situations to sadistically torture them in some kind of like Hitchcock sense,
well, I think
it's just ridiculous and simplistic. And so much of his art during this phase, before and after, is about these same themes. Mm-hmm. And yeah,
I think it's like, it's all like this like misunderstanding. Like you could say the same thing in like religion about like our like view of God, you know, as being like, is God a cruel God?
Oh, right.
Is the, you know, and that's a good question, because Bresson is simply kind of taking on that,
the cruel God, right, master.
And what I have to say about Bresson's, at least just film theory within this, is that it's about exposing that God is both loving and indifferent.
Right. Yeah.
There's a complexity there, and it's the same with this. He set this up. Yeah, sure. He transposed, or like he created this world in film where he created, in a sense, the reality in which Mouchette suffers. And he does take on that responsibility. He even says that himself. He takes responsibility for it.
Right.
Like God, we like, again, it goes back to like, who are we to blame for, like, is God this cruel God?
Right.
Are we being punished?
Right. And I think what's interesting is,
as a woman, am I punished for being, does God hate me because I'm born a woman?
Right,
I never
right.
asked for that, you know?
And instead, like, and I know everyone's just going to go, who cares about one critic? Like, yeah, I'm that guy. But it was a long essay that someone clearly put a lot of thought into. And I felt like, there's a line from Bresson from the interview during Mouchette where he says, Mouchette shows us the cruelty and misery we ordinarily choose not to see. And in the essay, the guy kind of tries to move over that, like, oh, society's cruel. But what I don't understand is, so we're supposed to make art, and this is the vibe that I get, and I know I mentioned this before, that is essentially, this is how things should be, because we believe women, and I would agree, women should have more autonomy, women should not be cruelly treated like shit by the world and society, that means we shouldn't make art about it. And I'm sure maybe if the
that it means that by making art, it somehow creates that same reality in which,
right, which feels,
it enforces that reality.
Right, which feels like, some kind of goofy,
it's blaming the victim, ultimately.
And just like some kind of goofy, like, violent video games make us, violent, or, essentially, Bresson's theory of the model, which is, it's weird because it's like, okay, so is the way we get to the truth of a character making them act like traditional actors? They don't have autonomy there either. They're acting and being in a film by itself, unless it's like the most experimental, which doesn't, there's all kinds of people that maybe tried, like, okay, the actors are going to lead the film. No matter what, the director is like a cruel dictator, even in the most community-driven film. Anyway, those are all interesting kind of thoughts. Okay, so now we're at the end of our first podcast in so long. Do you have any kind of like final thoughts or quotes you want to read regarding like your thoughts about this film and book?
Yeah. Since this is about suicide and Catholic realism, as like it's been called, I think like in the end it's a story about one like person who was never separate from the grace which is everywhere, and then in the end is returning. In a huge way, I feel like it's like God is like our ultimate, like he's been described by like people like Rumi and stuff as like ultimately our lover, the one who loves us and sees us the most. And in that way, like that's what we are always looking for and longing for, is this, like Bernanos says, like Bresson says about Bernanos that, like I've said over and over again, like the central theme is incommunicability. Mm-hmm. And so God in this situation is the only one who truly understands and sees you in that like that, you're completely unable to share any of this life, any of this deep heartache with anyone. Mm-hmm. You share that burden with no one. Only God shares that with us. And I mentioned Rumi and God as like kind of this ultimate partner or lover, one that understands us. Rumi once said, "In the existence of your love," talking about God, "I become non-existent. This non-existence that is linked to you is better than anything I have found in existence." Mm-hmm. And another, which he says, "The lover does not unite with the beloved. It dies in the beloved." Hell yeah. So, like,
what would you say if someone said, like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
How does it relate to Mouchette? I understand it, but if someone
Right.
was confused, if they were like just walking in here off the street.
Right. I would say that suicide can be seen as this like pathetic, lonely ordeal that one person faces, or it could be this, this moth that has longed for connection that finally burns up in the flame for which it's always longed for its entire life. Mm-hmm. And so this all-encompassing like love or return into the arms of God is linked to non-existence, and existence is hell, right? So the opposite of that, non-existence, is what we call heaven, but it's the absence of anything. It's emptiness, it's silence, but it's a silence which is ultimately intimate, loving, and receiving, or caring, you could say.
Yes.
And so, like, I think a lot of people are like get confused and like are like, Bresson is cruel, but he's just reflecting those qualities of the God that we do not and cannot understand in our struggle, when
right.
we're shaking our fists at him and saying, how dare you? How could you do this to me? It's a lot more complicated.
And as we suffer, we connect to the divinity of God. Because he's there through the suffering in some of it.
That's his will.
And then also, if we go back to Diary of a Country Priest, that kind of Bernanos talks about how, like, hell is the absence of love.
Yes.
And that
hell is to not love anymore.
To not love. And that even if in the book, Mouchette's like one feeling of love was the caress of the random girl or the boy like smiling at her.
Love is not any different than understanding in the case of
and even
this. Yeah.
And in the Christ sense, loving the one or feeling kinship with the one that has assaulted you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the same one with God. We forgive God in the same
hand that we like shake our hand at him.
Yeah, and with that, with like the same hand that God like swipes us down, that is equal and all the same as his love for us.
Right. That's so.
Yeah.
Well, I'm so glad we got to talk about this. I love this movie so deeply, and I know it's your favorite film. I mean, it's probably in my top 5, but like, all his films are so important. We'll eventually talk about, all the ones we love the most. Yeah, we're gonna do a lot more. But I guess we should wrap it up. Do you have any last thoughts? I'm Rusty Kelly.
And I'm Amelia McKay, and the song that you're about to hear comes from the very end of the movie Mouchette, and it's Monteverde's Magnificat. And this episode goes out to my dear friend Lauren Williams. Thank you so much.